For decades, the image of the Russian tank was a potent symbol of military might, an iron fist that projected power far beyond the Kremlin's walls. During the Cold War, endless columns of T-series tanks, rumbling through Red Square on parade, were designed to send a clear and intimidating message to the West. They were the steel backbone of the Soviet army, a seemingly unstoppable force poised to pour through the Fulda Gap in Germany. The very names, T-64, T-72, T-80, became synonymous with brute force and industrial-scale warfare. This wasn't just military hardware, it was a physical manifestation of Soviet ambition and a cornerstone of its global strategy, representing a very real and present danger to NATO forces. The legend of these machines was forged not just in parades, but in the conflicts that defined the latter half of the 20th century. From the deserts of the Middle East to the mountains of Afghanistan, the T-series tank was a ubiquitous presence on the world's battlefields. Its simple, rugged design meant it could be produced in vast numbers and operated by conscript armies with relatively basic training. Western intelligence agencies watched with concern, counting the thousands upon thousands of these vehicles rolling off Soviet production lines. The sheer quantity was a strategic weapon in itself, part of a doctrine that believed overwhelming numbers could triumph over technological sophistication. The Russian tank was, in essence, the ultimate tool of mass-scale attritional warfare. Even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the mystique endured. The newer T-90, a significant upgrade of the T-72, was marketed globally as one of the world's premier main battle tanks. It was fitted with new armor, advanced fire control systems, and a formidable 125mm smoothbore gun. Russia presented the T-90 as proof that its prowess in armored warfare had not diminished. It was the proud successor to a long and storied lineage, a vehicle that combined the classic Soviet emphasis on a low-profile and powerful armament with modern-day technology. For many observers, the Russian tank remained a benchmark of battlefield power, a weapon to be respected and feared in equal measure. However, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which began in February 2022, has subjected this long-standing reputation to the harshest test imaginable. The once feared columns of Russian armor have been systematically dismantled on the roads and fields of Ukraine. The images emerging from the conflict are not of triumphant advances, but of burnt-out husks, their turrets often blown clean off and lying meters away from the chassis. This devastating performance has forced a radical reassessment of a weapon system once considered a titan of land warfare. The war has peeled back the layers of myth and propaganda, exposing fundamental flaws that have been part of their design for over half a century. To understand why Russian tanks are failing so spectacularly in Ukraine, we must first journey back to the drawing boards of the Cold War. Soviet military doctrine was fundamentally different from that of its NATO adversaries. The guiding philosophy was one of mass and aggression. The plan was to overwhelm Western Europe with a tidal wave of armor, advancing at speed to achieve strategic objectives before NATO could fully mobilize its superior technological forces. This doctrine demanded a specific type of tank, one that was relatively cheap, simple to manufacture in enormous quantities, and operationally straightforward for a vast conscript army. The result was the T-series, a family of tanks that prioritized firepower and a low profile above all else, including the safety of the crew inside. This emphasis on mass production and a low silhouette led to a distinct design. Soviet tanks like the T-72 are noticeably smaller and more compact than their Western counterparts, such as the American M1 Abrams. A lower profile makes the tank a smaller target, which is, in theory, a significant advantage. To achieve this compact design, the Soviets made a critical decision. They replaced the fourth crew member, the human loader, with an automatic loading system. This allowed for a smaller turret and a reduction in the overall vehicle height. The tank now only required a commander, a gunner, and a driver. This three-man crew philosophy became the standard for all subsequent Russian main battle tanks, a choice that would have catastrophic consequences decades later. The doctrine of expendability extended from the machines to the men who crewed them. Soviet planners accepted that they would suffer heavy losses in any major conflict with NATO. Their strategy was not to win every single engagement, but to win the war by having more tanks and more soldiers to throw into the fight. Crew survivability, while not ignored entirely, was a secondary consideration compared to the primary goals of production volume and offensive capability. The tank was seen as a weapon to be used up and replaced, and tragically, the crew was often viewed in a similar light. This mindset is the polar opposite of Western military thinking, which places a huge premium on preserving the lives of its highly trained professional soldiers. This philosophy is baked into the very metal of every T-72, T-80, and T-90. While they are formidable offensive platforms, their design DNA carries a deep-seated legacy of disposability. The focus was always on the next offensive, the next breakthrough, and the relentless pace of the advance. The defensive capabilities, particularly in protecting the crew from a catastrophic hit, were compromised in favor of these aggressive objectives. The war in Ukraine has brutally exposed this trade-off. The battlefields of today are not the sweeping plains of the Cold War imagination. They are complex, lethal environments where survivability is paramount. And it is here that the Soviet doctrine of mass overprotection has met its disastrous end. At the heart of the Russian tank's vulnerability lies a single devastating design choice related to its autoloader. To feed shells into the main gun quickly, the system arranges its ammunition, both the projectile and the highly flammable propellant charge, in a circular carousel directly beneath the turret. This places the tank's entire ammunition supply right in the middle of the fighting compartment, encircling the commander and the gunner. In a T-72, for example, this carousel holds around 22 rounds of ready-to-fire ammunition. While this mechanical solution allows for a high rate of fire and a smaller turret, it effectively turns the tank's interior into a gigantic, exposed munitions locker. This is the Achilles heel of the entire T-series design. When an anti-tank missile or a powerful shell penetrates the tank's hull or turret, particularly from the side, there is a very high probability it will strike one of these propellant charges. The result is not a small fire. It is an instantaneous and catastrophic chain reaction. The propellant ignites, causing all the other shells in the carousel to detonate in a massive, violent explosion. The pressure inside the sealed steel hull becomes immense in a fraction of a second. This force has to go somewhere, and it invariably takes the path of least resistance, straight up. The explosion blasts the tank's turret, which can weigh over 15 tons, high into the air. This grim phenomenon has been given a chillingly descriptive name, the Jack-in-the-Box effect. It is the signature failure of Russian-designed tanks, and it has been documented hundreds, if not thousands, of times throughout the war in Ukraine. For the three-man crew inside, there is virtually no chance of survival. The detonation is instantaneous, giving them no time to escape. This single design flaw ensures that when a Russian tank is hit in the right spot, it is not merely disabled or damaged. It is utterly annihilated, along with its crew. The vehicle is rendered completely unrecoverable, a total loss of both man and machine. This vulnerability is not a new discovery. Military analysts have been aware of the T-series ammunition storage problem for decades, observing it in conflicts like the Gulf War and the wars in Chechnya. However, the sheer scale of the losses in Ukraine has brought it to the world's attention with shocking clarity. Every Jack-in-the-Box incident is not only a material loss for the Russian army, but also a devastating blow to its human capital. Experienced tank crews are a precious military resource, far more difficult to replace than a piece of equipment. The carousel autoloader, once seen as an innovative feature, has proven to be a fatal inheritance. The catastrophic Jack-in-the-Box effect seen in Russian tanks stands in stark contrast to the design philosophy of modern Western tanks, which places the highest priority on crew survivability. Designers of vehicles like the American M1 Abrams, the British Challenger 2, and the German Leopard 2 recognize the inherent danger of storing ammunition inside the crew compartment. Their solution was brilliantly simple but, honestly, profoundly effective. They moved the majority of the main gun's ammunition out of the main hull and into a separate, heavily armored compartment at the very back of the turret, an area known as the bustle. This fundamental design difference is the key reason why Western tank crews are far more likely to survive a direct hit. This separate ammunition storage is not just isolated by armor plate, it is also protected by a crucial safety feature known as blowout panels. These are specially designed panels on the roof of the ammunition compartment that are intentionally weaker than the rest of the turret structure. If the ammunition is hit and detonates, the force of the explosion is channeled upwards and outwards, away from the crew. The panels sacrifice themselves, directing the blast into the open air. An armored blast door, which is normally open only for a split second when the loader retrieves a round, slams shut, protecting the crew from the fire and pressure. The practical result of this design is that a Western tank can suffer an ammunition cook-off and still save its crew. The vehicle will be disabled, certainly, and will require extensive repair, but the soldiers inside have a very high chance of walking away. This allows the Army to preserve its most valuable asset, its experienced, highly trained personnel. The damaged tank can often be recovered from the battlefield, taken to a workshop, and eventually returned to service. For Russia, the loss of a tank almost always means the loss of its three-person crew, an unsustainable drain on its military's human resources and combat effectiveness. This divergence in philosophy highlights a core difference in how Russia and NATO nations view warfare and the value of their soldiers. For Western armies, which are composed of professional volunteers, every soldier represents a significant investment in training and experience. Losing a tank crew is a far greater blow than losing a tank. For Russia, which has historically relied on mass mobilization and conscription, the doctrine of expendability has persisted. The war in Ukraine has laid bare the terrible human cost of this calculus. A survivable tank design is not just a technical feature, it is a moral and strategic imperative that Russia's tank industry has for decades failed to prioritize. The inherent design flaws of Russia's tanks have been brutally exploited by a new generation of sophisticated anti-tank weapons supplied to Ukraine. Chief among these is the American-made FGM-148 Javelin. This is not a traditional anti-tank rocket that has to be aimed directly at the front of a tank. The Javelin is a fire-and-forget missile with an advanced seeker that allows it to attack from above. After launch, it climbs high into the air before plunging down onto its target. This top attack flight profile is specifically designed to strike the weakest part of any tank, its thin top turret and roof armor, which is a fraction of the thickness of its frontal protection. This method of attack is devastatingly effective against the T-series tanks. The missile's warhead strikes precisely where the vehicle is most vulnerable, easily penetrating the thin roof armor and entering the crew compartment. This is often directly above the deadly ammunition carousel. The Javelin also employs a tandem charge warhead. It has two explosive charges, one in front of the other. The small precursor charge is designed to detonate the tank's explosive reactive armor, those explosive bricks that cover many Russian tanks, microseconds before the main warhead hits. This neutralizes the tank's primary defensive layer, allowing the main charge to punch through the hull armor beneath, making a catastrophic kill almost certain. It's not just the high-tech Javelin causing havoc. A wide range of other anti-tank guided missiles, such as the British NLAW and the American TOW missile, have also taken a heavy toll. Recent combat footage from as late as May 2024 has shown even Russia's most advanced operational tank, the T-90M, being destroyed by TOW missiles fired from American-supplied Bradley fighting vehicles. These encounters demonstrate that even with modern upgrades like the relict reactive armor, the fundamental weaknesses of the T-series chassis remain. The missiles are simply too smart, too powerful, and too precise for the aging Soviet-era designs to handle. The proliferation of these weapons has completely changed the dynamics of the battlefield. A small mobile team of 2 or 3 soldiers equipped with a weapon like the Javelin can lie in ambush and destroy a 45-ton main battle tank from a safe distance. This creates an asymmetric threat that Russian tank columns have been unable to counter effectively. Every tree line, building, and piece of high ground can conceal a deadly threat. The Russian tank, once a tool of shock and awe, has become a high-value target, hunted relentlessly by infantry, armed with weapons that can strike with pinpoint accuracy from angles the tank was never designed to defend against. As if modern anti-tank missiles were not enough, Russian armor has found itself facing a second, equally lethal threat that has come to define the war in Ukraine: the mass proliferation of cheap disposable drones. Specifically, the widespread use of first-person view, or FPV kamikaze drones, has transformed the battlefield into a 24/7 hunting ground. These are small, fast, and highly maneuverable drones, often built from commercially available components, that are piloted by an operator wearing FPV goggles. They are essentially miniature remote-controlled cruise missiles, costing as little as $500 to produce, and they are being used to devastating effect against multi-million-dollar tanks. An FPV drone is typically armed with a simple anti-tank grenade or a shaped charge, like the warhead from an RPG-7 rocket. While this payload might not be powerful enough to penetrate the thick frontal armor of a tank, the drone's agility allows the operator to guide it with incredible precision to the tank's known weak spots. they can be flown directly into the thin top armor, the vulnerable rear engine deck, the tracks, or the gap between the turret and the hull. A skilled pilot can even fly a drone into the open hatch of a tank. This creates a persistent, low-cost threat that can swarm and overwhelm a tank's defenses at any time of day or night. In a desperate attempt to counter this top attack threat from both missiles and drones, Russian tank crews began welding crude metal cages or slat armor onto the tops of their turrets. These improvised contraptions, quickly nicknamed cope cages by online observers, were intended to detonate an incoming warhead prematurely before it could strike the main armor. However, their effectiveness has proven to be extremely limited. While they might occasionally stop a simple drone-dropped grenade, they offer little to no protection against the tandem warheads of missiles like the Javelin and are easily bypassed by skilled FPV drone pilots who can simply fly around or underneath them. The psychological impact of the drone threat on Russian tank crews is immense. Unlike a waiting missile team, the buzz of a drone can be heard from afar, creating a constant state of anxiety. These cheap, mass-produced weapons have democratized air power, allowing Ukrainian forces to create a kill chain that is both highly effective and economically sustainable. A single T-90M tank costs millions of dollars to produce, while the drone that destroys it can cost less than a television. This unsustainable economic attrition, combined with the material and human losses, has proven to be a war-losing equation for Russia's armored forces. The age of the drone has arrived, and the Russian tank was grievously unprepared for it. The war in Ukraine has served as a brutal epitaph for the Russian tank. The combination of a deep-seated design flaw, the lethal effectiveness of modern anti-tank weapons, and an unsustainable rate of attrition has shattered its long-standing reputation. The visually confirmed losses are staggering. By late 2025, analyses showed that Russia had lost thousands of tanks, including nearly 200 of its most advanced model, the T-90. With Russia's industrial base, hobbled by sanctions and struggling to produce perhaps 90 new T-90s per year, it is impossible to replace these losses. Russia is now forced to pull ancient T-62s and even T-55s out of deep storage, vehicles that are utterly obsolete on the modern battlefield. The failures go beyond just flawed design and a determined enemy. They are compounded by systemic issues within the Russian military itself: poor leadership, inadequate training, and a breakdown in discipline. Tanks have been deployed without adequate infantry support, making them easy prey for ambush teams. Crews, often poorly trained and with low morale, have demonstrated poor tactical awareness, abandoning perfectly functional vehicles at the first sign of trouble. The disco head incidents, where T-90 turrets spin uncontrollably after being hit, point to fragile electronics and inexperienced crews unable to manage battle damage, problems made worse by sanctions cutting off access to Western components. The Russian tank, once the feared symbol of the Red Army's unstoppable might, has become a liability. On the battlefields of Ukraine, it is a slow, vulnerable, and surprisingly fragile target. Its presence no longer inspires shock and awe, but rather presents an opportunity for Ukrainian forces armed with javelins, NLAWs, and a swarm of FPV drones. The fundamental operational concept of the T-series tank, a disposable weapon for a mass offensive, has been proven obsolete. It is a 20th century weapon system struggling and failing to survive in a 21st century conflict. The iconic silhouette is now more often seen as a burning wreck than as a conquering chariot. Ultimately, the story of the Russian tank in Ukraine is a cautionary tale about military hubris and the failure to adapt. The legacy of Soviet doctrine, with its disregard for crew survivability, has come back to haunt the modern Russian army with devastating consequences. The Jack-in-the-Box tank has become a symbol not of power, but of a catastrophic military disaster. What was once the iron fist of the Kremlin has been exposed as a glass jaw. The long, celebrated history of the Russian tank as a dominant force in land warfare has met a fiery and undeniable end in the mud and fields of Ukraine.